Hey, what's going on? In this video, I want to talk about a question that I got last week about a previous video I made on a learning to code resource called Launch School. Now, if you didn't watch that video, Launch School is, in my opinion, the best learn to code resource available. And I know that's a big statement. So this question is about one of the resources they use to teach in Launch School, which is the Ruby programming language. Very controversial in 2019. A lot of people say that Ruby is dead and that there's no point in learning it. So I'm gonna read this question real quick and then address some of what I thought was relevant to this conversation. So if that sounds interesting, I think you're gonna like this video. So without further ado, here's the question. So I do have a question for you. My main concern with doing any program like this, he's talking about Launch School, is marrying myself to a particular programming technology that may drop down in popularity down the line. A year or so ago, I mentioned doing Ruby to a colleague. He basically told me to steer away from it, but he wasn't really able to tell me why. Was it simply because he didn't know it well or at all? Was he a PHP guy? Question mark. And didn't want to promote it? That's another question. Who knows? Anyway, can you speak to that a little more? What does Launch School, or excuse me, why does Launch School teach Ruby instead of some other backend technology? Are you confident that the school is preparing you to more easily switch to another platform if you ever need to do so? So I have two caveats before I answer this. Caveat one is my laughable current level of engineering skills. So no professional engineer would consider my level of engineering skills on par with theirs. I'm still a learner and I'm going through this process myself. So if you're someone that already knows this answer for yourself and you're not willing to listen to someone who's not an expert level pro, you should probably click off this video because that's not me, but I'm gonna give you my opinion based on everything I've read, my experience in the program, my experience doing other prep courses for boot camps, and spending about a year in a computer science graduate program at a university here in the US. So caveat two, if you need a job as soon as possible, I would not recommend doing any program that's teaching any technology other than the one you need for the job. If you have a limited time, you need to start learning the technology or the programming language or the web stack that you're gonna be using in the job. And I think that goes without saying. So programs like Launch School, which focus on long-term learning and a mastery of the fundamentals of software engineering for web development, are probably not best for someone who needs to know a specific technology as soon as possible. So with those two caveats out of the way, I'm gonna give my answer to this. So as far as I know, Launch School teaches Ruby because it's a great tool to learn back-end technologies. And I think this argument makes sense. Of course, there's an element of they're using Ruby because that's what they started with and the curriculum is designed in Ruby. You always have this massive amount of momentum. Especially for anyone familiar with Launch School, their curriculum is nuts. I've never seen anything like it. It's extremely thorough, extremely detailed, down to the point where, there's hundreds of pages of detailed information and documentation on different coding challenges and problems and extremely nuanced information about those things that has literally no spelling or grammatical errors. Like this is they've taken the mastery-based approach to developing this curriculum, and it would be very difficult to just translate that to a new backend technology like Python, which is the one that many people probably would rather use at this point. So the only thing that I see that makes sense from their point of view is, of course, they've already started it and the curriculum is amazing. But the second thing is, and they've made this clear from the start, before they, I'm sure before they decided to use Ruby, or regardless of what technology they're using, they made a decision to use the technology just as a tool for teaching the fundamentals of backend web development technology, okay? Or not web development, whatever you want to call that. Back-end languages that are used to run web apps. They wanted to teach the fundamentals of how to do that, and they're just using Ruby as a teaching tool for that. They're teaching a lot of principles that are independent of whatever language you're using. Ideas like variable scoping. Variable scoping is an idea that you really need to understand in detail for how a specific language works, but if you understand the nuances of that and how it works for that language, you're gonna know where to look to figure out how other languages do that. So fundamental things like that you need to know, they're trying to teach and are focused on, more so than any specific tricks you can use with a specific language. It's a syntax that they're telling you to use all the time, or anything that's language specific. So of course, if you need to know a language ASAP, that's not gonna work for you. But again, if you're someone that's trying to master the fundamentals, they're using it as a teaching tool. And for this purpose, I think Ruby's great. Ruby doesn't have a lot of the difficulties in the syntax that other languages have. It's very beginner friendly. And I think for that reason, you can make an argument that it's a great, maybe even one of the best languages for what they're trying to use it for, which is teaching those principles. You're never gonna get very hung up on the syntax when you're using a beginner-friendly, high-level language like Ruby. So I think it's great for that. Is it the best for your specific use case? Maybe, maybe not. I'm gonna get into what I would like to see later on in this. So the next part is just the mastery-based learning idea. The whole program is based around that. They're trying to teach the first principles of web app software engineering and software engineering and computer science in general. They're really focused on this first principles approach to learning and getting to a high level of proficiency on the basics. So the next part is, I do feel confident that it will allow you to transition into new technologies, because for your next learning journey, for your next new technology that you want to learn, you're not gonna have all these unknown unknowns, okay? So for the example I used before, this very simple idea of variable scoping, if you're learning a language and you've only learned one and you don't know all the nuances and why the language made the choices, or the creator of the language made the choices he did about variable scoping or some of these more nuanced issues, you're not gonna even know to look for those things when you move to your next technology. However, if you're learning a language in very high level of detail and understanding all the different nuances and trade-offs that language made and how that's different from some of the other languages out there, some of the other options that could have been made for those specific nuances of the language, you're going to be looking for those things the next time you're learning a new language or a new technology. So I do believe that learning to a high level of proficiency, learning all the nuances about one technology, will allow you to more quickly do the same thing when you move on to another technology. You won't have all these unknown unknowns about a technology, about all the different options that were made in one that might not be the same in another. So similar to this with a language, for the web stack and how a web stack fits together and how the technologies you're using to build a web app fit together, if you understand that to a high level of proficiency, you know all the details about how it works and what the trade-offs are between the technologies you're using, you're gonna have a better idea of all the pieces that need to be in place and how they fit together and the different trade-offs that you're gonna have when you're assembling your next web app and you're using that next tech stack or the next combination of technologies. It'll be much easier to switch one out or another and understand the overall picture of how things are fitting together, because any system or machine, once you've taken it apart and put it back together in just about every way possible, the level of understanding that you have for that system is much higher than someone that's just assembled it one time. And that's kind of a good analogy for the way that they do their curriculum and the technologies they use versus a lot of other web development curriculums that really just give you a high level understanding of how things fit together, maybe give you one in-depth run through of some of the details of how that system fits together for something like a web app, and then kind of just cut you loose. So very different, and I think the way that they teach things will make it much easier when you move on and learn another technology. Okay, so if you are talking about Ruby specifically, you'll notice if you go on GitHub, I believe for some of the trends in 2019, Ruby is like the number 10 most popular programming language. It's pretty far down, right? It's not one of the top ones. Some of the top programming languages everyone would be familiar with are things like Java, Python, JavaScript. So you would probably think, if you want all the positives of Ruby with a more pragmatic language in 2019, you'd think, hey, why isn't maybe the backend part taught in one of the JavaScript backend technologies like Node.js or Python? Why aren't they just teaching JavaScript and Python? And I think that's a great question. I think in an ideal world, they would have a way to translate the level of depth and amount of information that they have in the Ruby curriculum to a language like Python. But again, I really think that should be a secondary concern. You're not learning to that level of depth to become a Ruby expert. You're learning to that level of depth to become someone that understands all the underlying choices that were made and the trade-offs that are being made in a specific language that could have been another way. I'm not going to give a ton of examples for that because I don't think it's too important, but I do think that getting into depth on any one of these languages is going to give you insight into some of the trade-offs and ways that it could be different in a different language and why those are, important differences. So the last thing that I'll talk about is a really good article that I think of when I think on this topic is Peter Norvig's Teach Yourself to Program in 10 Years article. And in the article, one of the things he talks about is that he believes any good programmer should learn at least, at a minimum, probably around 5 languages, but there's no specifics, right? His point is you should learn a number of different types of language that focus on a number of different use cases and have different trade-offs so that you're understanding how these trade-offs affect the language and the architecture for the software you're trying to build and why those differences are important. So he gives a list of languages he believes people should learn. I believe there are 5, but he says that's just at a minimum. One of his important points is that you should be language agnostic and understand how to switch between technologies and get spun up on a new technology quickly. So this is a skill you eventually need to have if you want to be a high-level programmer. So in the resources for this in the description, I'm gonna link a whole search topic that came up with tons of great videos on learning new languages fast. I think those more experienced software engineers who teach all these different languages and have specific courses around learning your second, third, fourth language will be able to give you a better idea of the time frame it's going to require for you to learn a new technology once you're familiar with your first one. And I'm also gonna link a description to a Teach Yourself Hacking article. This article, Teach Yourself Hacking. Basically, it's if you already know a language well and you're just trying to learn a new web technology, it's a systematic way to go into open source technologies, sift through code, make small changes, and then repeat that process over and over as you build up to larger and larger code bases on the new language you're trying to learn. I think this is awesome because if you do have a really in-depth fundamentals understanding of a language, like the understanding you'll have of Ruby if you go through launch school, it'll be much easier to go use this learning to hack or hacking into a new code base way of learning, which is a much more abbreviated way of learning. You're not sitting there doing all these toy problems. You're basically moving into a code base, understanding it, changing a feature, and then going into larger and larger, progressively larger code bases and changing larger and larger aspects of that code base as you become more familiar with the new language. And that type of learning model will be available to you after you have that in-depth fundamental understanding of your first set of technologies, which I think is cool. So both of those things are gonna be linked in the description. That's pretty much it for this video. So if you liked it, make sure to hit the like button. Comment below letting me know what I left out, or if you're an experienced developer and everything I said was completely inaccurate, make sure to let me know in the comments as well. If you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified anytime that I come out with new videos, make sure to hit the subscribe button. And as always, thank you for watching.